Hi, and welcome to MindSet, an HCD vidcast, where we dive into the world of applied consumer neuroscience and market research with leading experts in the field. My name is Michelle and Kathryn, PhD in behavioral neuroscience and Director of Research and Innovation at HCD.
And I'm Kathryn Ambrose, the Manager of Behavioral and Marketing Sciences with HCD. As your hosts, we are going to act as the buzzkills for the buzzwords, taking time to critically think about the limitations and pitfalls of emerging trends and topics within the field to help you identify what innovation has a lot of untapped potential or is too good to be true.
Now, HCD is a full-service research house which provides research capabilities on consumers by looking at how they perceive, evaluate, and respond to different types of stimuli, such as looking at product experiences, communications, or just general consumer and shopper experiences. We use a combination of tools that come from psychology, physiology, neuroscience, as well as the traditional methods that people typically use to see how they experience different stimuli. That stimuli can range from the early stages of exploration all the way through the final product validation tests. This is what we refer to as applied consumer neuroscience.
So stick around for more curious conversations as we chat our way through the ever-evolving space of consumer science.
Hi, welcome, Michael. So excited to have you join us. We're missing Kathryn, but she's busy today, but we really wanted to have this conversation with you because we really enjoyed having you as our intern this summer. So just as an introduction, we had 2 interns from the UPenn MBDS program, and you can tell us a little bit more about that in a second. But first, introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for having me. As Michelle said, I just wrapped up my internship with HCD this summer, and that was the culminating part of my master's degree at the University of Pennsylvania in Behavioral and Decision Sciences, or MBDS, which is much shorter. And essentially that degree equips its students with the ability to really change behavior. I know that's sort of a big goal and it doesn't always happen the way we want, but we're really given the tools to diagnose behavior and really think about what measurements are important in terms of making behavior better for the good of our society. And within that, there's a lot of different areas you can focus within. And for me, it's probably health and everyday health habits, but always open to exploring more things. And it was really cool to learn some new methodologies with HCD, which we'll get into in a little bit, I imagine.
Yeah. I want to hear a little bit about, so your undergrad before you joined the program, where do you come from?
Yeah, so I studied neuroscience and I also got a health studies certificate at Dickinson College, and I graduated from there in May of 2020. If you're not familiar with Dickinson, it's in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, so Central Pennsylvania, right outside of Harrisburg. And that was a great experience. I started out wanting to learn more about the clinical side of neuroscience, and then gradually found myself gravitating more and more towards psychology and behavior, specifically behavior change.
That's really interesting because I did my undergrad in psychology and neuroscience as well. And, I think the traditional trajectory of that is to go into grad school and become very much a bench scientist, right? So when you think of neuroscience, like you said, it's very clinical or maybe it's very academic research. And so what do you think kind of influenced you to really think more about these decision sciences types of direction?
I just had to go with what was exciting me more, really, to put it in the simplest way. I found myself fascinated, of course, by science and what medicine has done, for example, to help people. But where I felt the most excitement and urgency was using what is known in science and helping people sort of reap those benefits of the research, of exercise, sleep, diet, etc. And that's where I felt that I personally would enjoy myself the most and find a really rewarding career out of that. Specifically, what that looks like, I'm not sure yet,
Yeah.
but it's an exciting field to, I think about.
Well, I think the wellness space has actually really started to develop more and more, whether it's,
Mhm.
employee health and wellness, or maybe programs that people can join, normal people in their everyday lives that doesn't have to be through work, like Noom, for example, has been like really successful, right? So it seems like there could be a lot of opportunities here to see how you can influence behaviors and the way people think to make better choices, right?
Exactly. And so much of that, and I think so much of the success behind these companies are not really producing new research about, okay, how much water should I drink in a day or anything like that. It's really about setting up an environment where someone can feel that they can succeed in their wellness goals. And again, that's just really exciting to me. And definitely an up and coming space. I only imagine it will grow.
Oh, absolutely. And so you decided to join UPenn and their program. What made you choose UPenn's program?
Yeah, so that interest of mine that I mentioned that I developed at Dickinson, that was, I would say, one that I really committed to in the second half of my undergrad experience. And I really wanted to get more skills and more foundational knowledge within behavioral science. And that's what really prompted me to think about grad school in the first place.
Yeah.
And the MBDS program was really the only one that, well, it was the only one I applied to because it was the only one that I felt really fit my needs. And I felt
Mm.
like I can learn a lot from it, but also contribute a lot to that program. And so that's sort of how I got there. But I always like to share that my cousin, it was actually a Christmas gift. He got me the book Nudge, which you
Oh,
might be familiar with.
yeah.
And that's what really got me doing more research into grad school programs specifically within behavioral science. So that was
Sure.
also, I'd be remiss not to mention that.
No, that's a really cool story. I like that. And there aren't a lot of specifically behavioral science programs, right? So when you think about behavioral sciences, it's really like a mix. It's got, behavioral economics, which tends to be more in the business schools type of situation. And you're talking
Mhm.
about a neuroscience perspective or maybe a psychology perspective. And again, that usually kind of sits in its own house. And it does seem that recently there are some schools that have started to make these interdisciplinary groups, like the one UPenn has. So it seems very fortuitous that you're able to find something. And particularly UPenn seems to have a really good program for having sort of different directions you can go with behavioral sciences, like policy, something more consumer oriented, very health oriented. So it seems like that was really good choosing on your part.
Thank you. Yeah. And it was such a great program because of, like you alluded to, sort of the way that you can be in control of the direction that you want to take and, within the program and also after. There are several electives that you're able to take outside of your core classes. And one of them was consulting, for example. And so there's a track for consulting, there's a track for, like you said, policy. So thank you. Yeah, there's a lot of options. So big kudos to that program.
Now, the other cool thing that the program has is that they do have these internship opportunities where they partner with different companies. And we just joined them very recently. We've been in talks with them for over a year about coming up with a way to get more involved with the students, because we love learning more, especially working with academics, but also we love having interns and we love exploring ideas that we can't typically do right on our own, because so much of our work of course is client oriented, and so being able to do these more sort of fun projects, development projects, has been really exciting for us. So UPenn does have this internship program as your capstone. Can you tell me a little bit more about how that worked for you, like choosing different, I think there were different projects you could choose from?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So on the student end, we were given a list of clients like yourself who were very generous and offered an internship program that would also serve as the capstone. And so we ranked our top choices. I will say HCD was my top choice. So
Oh.
really glad that it worked out. And Yeah, so essentially we ranked our choices. We filled out a survey sort of explaining what skills we wanted to focus on. And then our advisors, they, being that they knew us very well, they were able to sort of pair us based on, the different capacities that different organizations had, and also thinking about the skill sets. So it was sort of in partnership with our advisors.
Okay. Yeah.
Mhm.
Who is your advisor?
Yeah, so we have two in the program, Chris Nave and Daniela Denise, and they both worked together to help with this program.
Perfect. And so when Kathryn and I were the ones that came up with the ideas, and we were thinking, what would be something that was very, relevant that people might be interested in, that would help us develop some of our methodologies and skills. And of course, right now we are in 2021, and people were, it was summer, right? And so a lot of places were starting to open back up following the COVID-19 pandemic, which is ongoing, right? And so there was a lot of interest in learning a bit about people's perceptions, particularly as places start opening up. And with the summer, everybody wanted to get out and do something fun. They've been, locked in at home, and they really wanted to take vacations. They wanted to go do something fun with their families, see friends. And so for us, we came up with the project. Can you tell us a little bit about what you saw, like what the project is?
Yeah, and thanks again for offering that, a really fun project. But essentially what we looked at was consumer needs when they think about attending entertainment venues, and particularly with COVID-19 in mind. And so the question I would say was, what are some gaps between the needs of consumers and the perceptions of venues, specifically entertainment venues?
Yeah. And so for us, we wanted to use methodology we use a lot in consumer research, right? Which is what we call MaxImplicit. And MaxImplicit is the combination of a very quant traditional methodology with a more psychological implicit methodology. So we used MaxDiff, which is a forced ranking exercise. So you have a list of things and you have to basically rank them. I like to say that it's kind of like when you have the NBA playoffs, right? And you have teams pitted up against each other. That's how MaxDiff works, right? You have two statements that pit up against each other, and you have to decide which one is most important. And then we had implicit association, which is the psychological side, which is where we would see people's perceptions, like how, when they see a different type of venue, what did they think about it? Is it fun? Is it safe? Is it ideas like that? So the MaxDiff gives us, we were looking at more of the needs that people have to feel safe to go out. And then the implicit was looking at what's their actual perception of different locations. So you get the needs and then the perceptions, which ultimately gives you the need gaps. Can you tell us a little bit more about each of those parts? So what sort of statements were you looking at with the MaxDiff?
Yeah, so within the MaxDiff, the statements were largely about the safety precautions that could be offered at a venue. So I would say, by and large, that's what was being asked about in that portion of the survey. And an example statement could be that the venue requires everyone to wear a mask, or the venue will require social distancing. We also added some statements beyond that, such as the experience is fun, the experience is worthwhile. And so that's what we really were gathering with the MaxDiff, again, to see what consumers really wanted when they were thinking about attending a venue.
So what did they want? What was important to people?
Yeah, so an interesting theme with the top needs are that, at least in the top 5 needs, they really center around trust, I would say. And I say that because, and as you pointed out, Michelle, that those needs, they are not very obvious and they're not very visible at the venue. And so because they're not visible at the venue, you sort of have to assume that they happen before you arrive. And what I'm talking about are things like deep cleaning. We sort of assume that a seat, for example, is cleaned before we get there. And also ventilation. You can't necessarily see that a venue has upgraded its ventilation standards. But again, that's really getting at the underlying theme of trust within those top consumer needs.
So understanding that, what the needs are of consumers that are going to want to go out to places, just based on that, what do you think your recommendations are for venues that are looking to open up and bring people back in?
Yeah, so I think to answer that question, I'm going to contrast the top needs with what some of the bottom needs are.
Mm.
And those needs that we found that weren't highly ranked were things that were very specific, such as requiring a quarantine period, things like that, contactless payment that, again, are in contrast to the top ones, they're very visible at the venue and it's happening. You're going to expect that to happen once you get to the venue. And so with that, I think my recommendation would be, instead of focusing, time and effort into really specific and potentially pricey interventions that I mentioned, maybe focus more on developing trust with that consumer base, whether it's through marketing or communications.
That's really interesting, because I think when you look at things that are being communicated right now by different facilities and different event locations, they really are talking about very specific things, which, as you said, those are at the bottom of the list. So, people are talking about contactless payment, and they're talking about how, they've upgraded ventilation systems or what that, those sort of things. But it sounds like what you're saying is they really consumers need to be sort of emotionally supported, maybe a little bit more encouraged on why they should trust a venue. And that makes a lot of sense to me, because when I'm thinking about places that I want to go to, it's very much, is it worth it to me? Is it worth it to potentially expose myself? And that potential is definitely driven by how well I trust the location and the people that are there, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think that makes a lot of sense to me as well. I think at least what I can say from the data are that what's going to push someone potentially from a prospective consumer to an engaged consumer is maybe feeling that trust. I think that those venues that can accomplish that will, I think, do relatively well compared to those venues that don't. And of course, all of this is dependent on what the guidelines are according to that
Which is changing all the time.
Yeah, which is changing. And so I do think that also means that data like these could be potentially really valuable to venues which might not be sure about what consumers want, given sort of this gray area that we're in.
Yeah. And it might be different for different types of venues, right? So understanding, even how people see different types of venue, which is really where the implicit comes in, right? So we looked at, lots of different types of locations. What were some of those locations that you looked at?
Yeah, so we had a total of 9 locations. And so these included places like an indoor bar, an amusement park, a movie theater. We actually asked about both indoor and outdoor movie theaters, multi-day, excuse me, my camera fell. Multi-day music festivals, which are really popular this time of year, at least in the United States, indoor sporting events, outdoor sporting events, so things like that. So we had a total of 9 venues that we looked at.
And what were some key findings you got from the implicit?
Yeah, so what we did with the implicit was we sort of ranked the 9 into the top venues and the bottom venues. And by top, I mean those venues that seem to be in alignment with what the consumer needs were. So the ones that, in my determination, were most likely to sort of meet that trustworthiness goal. Unfortunately, we didn't ask about trustworthiness directly within the implicit test. That's definitely something I wish we had done, but of course, I wouldn't think
We
of
saw
that.
in the data later. Yeah.
Yeah, hindsight's 2020. But so instead of trustworthiness, I chose the words safe, reliable, and organized as proxies of the ability to trust a venue. And so there were 4 venues that had at least a medium association with those 3 words, safe, reliable, and organized. They were indoor movie theaters, outdoor movie theaters, and then the other 2, I'm actually gonna check that right now because I have it open. Indoor live performing arts, so a play or something like that, and also outdoor sporting events. So those were the 4 venues that seemed to be doing pretty well in terms of offering a venue that is somewhat trustworthy, at least, by proxy of those other words.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's really interesting. And I know that some of the ones you put towards the bottom that really weren't meeting those needs,
Mhm.
their biggest association seemed to be with fun, right?
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of the venues scored high on fun, which makes sense. They're entertainment venues, but that seemed to be especially true with those that weren't performing as well.
Interesting.
Mhm.
Now, you also, a big part of this particular internship was our big request on top of doing this interesting question was to also find different ways to visualize. And so you did a really great thing of clustering. Can you explain what clustering means?
Yeah, and I was really lucky to have done clustering in the course at Penn just prior to this internship. So that was a great coincidence that I think worked out for us both. But clustering, it's essentially taking a look at the participants and grouping them by similarity. And specifically, that was done with k-means clustering, and that works by essentially minimizing the distance between participants within a cluster. And so, I don't exactly understand the math completely, to be honest. But the
A little
point is
complicated.
that,
Yeah.
yeah, it's a little complicated. I just let the code do its thing and try to
Yeah.
understand the most important parts. But essentially, when you cluster participants, such as in this study, those within the same cluster are more similar to each other than they are similar to those outside of the cluster. And so what we're able to come up with then after that clustering is done is sort of cluster profiles, and we can take a look at what these distinct groups of people are, and what they look like and what their priorities are.
So basically, from the questions that we asked and the max diff and the implicit, we're able to take all that data and kind of come up with segments, basically, right? So there's this type of responder, this type of responder, and that type of responder. So we did come up with 3 clusters. Can you tell us a little bit about those?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And this was probably one of the most fun parts of looking at these data. So with your help, we we had the 3 clusters, and we named them sort of according to what they were most distinct in with regards to their priorities or demographics or something like that. And so what we came up with was the first cluster, and that's the diverse hesitant cluster. So relatively among the 3, they were the most diverse in terms of ethnicity and race. So about 1/3 of them was not white, which again, relatively, that was the highest share of non-white participants in the diverse hesitant cluster. And they were also hesitant in terms of COVID-19 vaccination rates. So we did collect vaccination history within the survey, and 1/3 of that cluster was not vaccinated. And of that 1/3, 94% of them either did not intend to get a vaccine against COVID-19 or they were unsure. So hence the diverse hesitant cluster name. And also their top priority in terms of, which we gathered in the max diff, those were mostly centered around feeling safe and that there were precautions at the venue.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second cluster we called the conservative cluster. About 58% of them noted that they identify as either, in political terms, conservative or very conservative. About 83% of them were white, and 2/3 were not vaccinated. And of that unvaccinated group within the cluster, I think it was 77% did not intend to get vaccinated or they were unsure. So, pretty firm in that stance, it seemed like. And to contrast with the first cluster, within the conservative group, they, in terms of their max diff priorities, they were mostly focused on having fun, and they also prioritized freedom of choice.
Yeah.
And so, again, a very distinct cluster. They were actually the most distinct cluster of the 3. There was slight overlap between the first one that I told you about, diverse hesitant, and the third one, which I'll tell you about next. But this second cluster, they were very unique, not any overlap or very minimal overlap. But then the third cluster is called the vaccinated liberals cluster. And most of them were vaccinated, over 85%, which is really high. That's,
Yeah.
like I said, it's hard to think of another demographic that would have vaccination rates that are that high.
Mhm.
And they were also noteworthy in that very few of them identified as conservative. They also had the relatively largest share of Asian Pacific Islander individuals at 13%. And they resembled cluster one. Like I said, there was some overlap between the two, but in terms of their max diff priorities, they also prioritized uh, precautions at venues and feeling safe, but their bottom priority was actually luxury. So they were not very driven by feeling luxurious at a venue.
So having that sort of information, being able to segment people, which is of
Mhm.
course a big interest when we're thinking about consumer research, but definitely for health research as well, for public health sort of situations, really thinking about the best ways to communicate to different populations, right? So it seems like there are different approaches that should potentially be taken with these different clusters, and that different types of venues, those that, are more on that trust side or ones that are more fun, may be able to use this sort of information to change their messaging a little bit, to direct their conversation to certain groups.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I've really liked about joining this project is right from the start, Michelle, you had said that it would be a great goal to be able to come up with actionable insights that we could share with venues. And
Yeah.
I appreciate that so much because that's also something really central to the MBDS curriculum,
Mm,
being able to use behavioral science for to create really actionable insights. So
yeah.
I completely agree. I think this is something that would be really useful to venues to think about and hopefully incorporate into their messaging.
Well, I think you did a really amazing job. I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you felt about your overall experience, because you're coming to the end of your
Mhm.
program, right? And you're going to be moving on to bigger and better things. So your experience overall, how do you feel, and has it changed the direction you wanted to take when you first entered the program?
Overall, it was such a great internship experience. It was really organized. I mean, there was really seamless, I would say, throughout the entirety of this experience. And, I'm just really appreciative that you offered it in the first place, but then went above and beyond that by making it really seamless. So thank you again. In terms of my next steps, I think I feel more confident working with data. It's something that I was obviously introduced to in undergrad, given, the STEM major that I had in neuroscience, but I didn't always have a lot of opportunities to sort of apply that knowledge independently. Whereas I
Yeah.
felt, and with this experience, I felt like I was able to do that more than I really have in the past. So, that's something that I'll definitely keep in mind. I definitely want to work in wellness, like I mentioned earlier, and having more confidence working with data. I think that's something that could definitely help me explore options that I might not have prior to this experience.
That's really awesome. In thinking about some of the work that you did, one thing that really stood out to me and impressed me was your experience with R. Um, I think that is definitely a skill that is important to develop in the current, climate of this type of work. I think it's a very valuable skill. So I would imagine that's going to help you moving forward in the future, at being able to work with data more.
Yeah, there's more data now than there ever was before, and there's so many things that we can measure with a lot more efficiency. So it makes sense to, be able to sort of work with data in the capacity you're comfortable with. And
Mhm.
for me, that was in R. And I hope to use that again in the future for sure. I imagine it's one of those skills where you kind of use it or lose it. And so hoping that it could be useful for what's next.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, I think this has been really amazing. And we got so much great feedback, both from your program, from Daniela, for example. I've had some conversations with her, and getting great feedback from the HCD team after they saw your presentation. Everybody was just really blown away. So you've done an amazing job here. And, we're so happy to get to talk with you about what you did and also see what happens to you in the future. So I just want to say a big thank you to you and congratulations on an awesome job.
Thank you so much. The pleasure was mine to join you with this internship. So thanks again so much for offering it. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you.